Welcome to our review on pathogens and disease. First thing we need to know then is, what is a pathogen? And quite simply, when we talk about a pathogen, what we're referring to is a microorganism that causes disease. Now, the way that pathogen will do this is either by causing direct damage to the cells, or it will release a toxin that then causes those symptoms of the disease. If we think about the types of pathogen that are likely to be responsible for communicable diseases in plants and animals, we see a bit of a variation here. So in people, most communicable diseases are caused by either bacteria or viruses, whereas in plants, most of them are caused by viruses or fungi. If we think about bacteria first of all, then hopefully this is a bit of a recap on your first topic where you looked at prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. So bacteria are prokaryotic cells. They're actually single-celled organisms, and they range in size from about 1 micrometer to 10 micrometers in size. And in the picture at the bottom there, you can see a very small sample of the different sizes and shapes of them that we actually see in the world. When we think about how these bacteria are going to reproduce, then they use a process called binary fission. So binary meaning two, fission, splitting. So quite simply, they split into two. And you can see a diagram of this in the top right there. So we start off with one bacterial cell, that will split into two, those two become four, those four become 8, and so on. And this means that they can actually reproduce really quickly. If you consider that some of these bacteria actually can do this every 20 minutes, then we end up with something called exponential growth. And that's the graph in the bottom right there. So we start with a relatively small number and they increase in number very quickly. Once they've done this, they will either produce toxins that are then released into your body that will have damaging effects, or they're going to damage the cells directly themselves. Second type of pathogen we're going to look at are the viruses. If we think about a virus, they are smaller than bacteria first of all, and they usually have a regular shape to them. And you can see some of the shapes of viruses at the bottom there in the illustration. A key thing about viruses though is that they can't reproduce on their own. The only way they can reproduce is by taking over a host cell and using all the machinery within that cell to make more virus particles. When it comes to the viruses reproducing, as we've said, they're going to take control of the host cells. So you can see the illustration at the bottom as to what's happening. So the virus will actually insert its genetic material into a host cell, and then that's going to take control of all the machinery in there in order to make more virus proteins. Those virus particles then get put together, and then when they get to enough of them in the cell, then literally they burst out of the cell, destroying it in the process, and go off to infect many other cells to repeat the process. The third type are the protists. Now, protists are eukaryotes, and these are mostly single-celled organisms. What we find with our protists though is that they usually require a vector to transfer them from one organism to another. And malaria is a really good example of this, that the way it's transferred from one human to another is via the vector of a mosquito. The final type, the fungi, can either be single-celled or they can have a body made up of these thread-like filaments called hyphae. Now, as those hyphae grow, then what they do is they can actually penetrate into the skin or into the surface of the plant. And when that happens, obviously they've got inside, they've got through that barrier, and they can cause disease. Another downside to fungi is that they can produce these things called spores. Now, spores are problematic because that's how they can spread from one organism to another. And there are certain types of spores that are incredibly resistant to death. So they will hang around in the environment for a really long time, or be quite resistant to mild heat treatments as well. So they can be problematic for us. What we need to consider now is how these pathogens are actually going to get into your body. And there are 3 key ways that they can do this. The first one is by travelling through the air. And the way that they're going to do this is in something called droplet infection. So what we actually find is that when you cough or sneeze, then there are these tiny droplets of mucus that spring forth from your mouth or nose and travel through the air. The downside is that inside each of those droplets of mucus, there are also going to be pathogens. So you can see the lovely picture on the right there of someone sneezing without covering their mouth or nose. Every single little bit you can see there is a droplet of mucus stuffed full of pathogens just waiting to land on the person next to her and infect them. If you inhale those pathogens, then you are at risk of catching that disease. So this is how things like influenza spread through your school really quickly. Because when people are coughing and sneezing without covering, all of those droplets are being just spread through the air, landing on you, your books, the surfaces, and you're inhaling all these lovely things. The second method is by direct contact. So this is when you're touching a contaminated surface. And a really good example of this, as my delightful picture will hopefully tell you, is athlete's foot. So if you're wandering around barefoot in changing rooms, for example, and someone has walked on that surface before you with athlete's foot like that, then you are also at risk of catching it because they've left some of those fungal entities on the surface that can then just adhere to your foot, and then athlete's foot may well follow. The third way is through water. And there's a couple of different ways that this could take place. So one of the most common problems that we find in developing countries is the fact that they don't have great water treatment facilities. So that means that they're drinking water that could very well be contaminated with fecal matter. So whether they're in a situation where they're washing their clothes in the same place they will collect their drinking water from, or whether animals are sharing that same watering area, then there's a good chance that there's fecal matter present. If there's fecal matter present, then we've got the bacteria from the gut present as well. So this is how cholera can spread through populations quite easily. The other one is if you're bathing in the water that's contaminated, again, you can pick up a range of infections from that. Hopefully at the end of this video you can recall the different types of pathogen and how they're actually going to reproduce, and you can also recall the 3 techniques by which they can spread from one organism to another.